Great, well, thank you. And that was a great film. And thanks to everybody who put that together. My name is Jimmy Mulville, and I'm thrilled tonight to be hosting an event which sees the beginning of our year of lectures in COVID. And we're delighted tonight to welcome someone who needs no introduction. I'll give her one anyway. It's Professor Dame Mary Beard, who's a star of the classical world. She's probably done more to popularize and to bring classic to the nation, making it feel relevant, which of course we know it is, and alive and vital. And she's a fantastic broadcaster, and we're thrilled to have her. She's going to speak on a subject, Roman emperors through a Victorian lens. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the whole session over to Mary. Welcome.
Thank you very, very much, Jimmy. And it's great to be here doing a gig for Classics for All, which is doing such great work. You've seen a bit of it and you'll get a chance to hear more about it. So I feel very privileged to be here and to be meeting friends, as I can see from the chat box. Friends old and new, even if we can't kind of communicate with each other or orally, we can see we're here. So thank you. I want to spend about half an hour looking at modern images of Roman emperors. They're going to be mainly 19th century ones, not absolutely entirely, as you see. And I've got a very, very simple aim here, which is actually to make these modern images of Roman emperors seem just a bit more interesting, because I think the truth is that even, us keen classicists, we do tend to walk past lineups of modern busts of Roman emperors, and we do tend to glaze over a bit when we come to gallery walls with their images of heroic or truly disgusting practices by ancient emperors. They don't really grip us. And I suppose I'm partly curious to why that is and how we might do something about that. I think why is that we now tend, I guess, to treat lineups of busts of emperors as kind of rather posh wallpaper, right? And we tend to treat paintings of the deeds of Roman emperors, and often the slightly despicable ones, we tend to treat those as kind of a sort of Roman classical alibi for, well, to put it bluntly, often a bit of soft porn. And I think occasionally the truth is also that we don't actually recognize the scenes that the painters largely, and I'm mostly talking about painting, we don't actually recognize the Roman scenes that are on the canvas. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and I will do that for most of the rest of the time. I mean, I picked this out at pretty much at random. It's as you can see, a mid-16th century painting. It's not 19th century, but what it's showing is one of the most almost cliched scenes depicting a Roman emperor in his reign that you can find from the early Renaissance up to the 19th century, though it's not one that is any longer on our agenda. And in fact, it's an entirely apocryphal scene as far as we know, that first occurs in about the 6th century CE. And what it shows is the Emperor Augustus. The Emperor Augustus is there kneeling down in the middle of the foreground, next to a Sibyl, a pagan prophetess wearing her blue outfit. And she's pointing up to the sky. Augustus has actually just asked her whether whether there would ever be anybody in the world more powerful than him. Good question. and whether he should allow himself to be worshipped as a god. And why she's pointing up to the sky is that, in fact, this is the very day on which Jesus is born. And in the sky, there is an image of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. Augustus sees this and he gets his answer. Now, it was an absolutely classically central image for kind of aligning the pagan world of antiquity and the Christian world of antiquity. And you can find a painting of this subject in almost any art gallery, big art gallery that you go to. But it has slipped out of our consciousness. And as I say, we kind of look at it, we don't recognize it, and we move on. I want to, however, concentrate on some forgotten figures, but not quite as forgotten figures as this. And I want to sort of highlight what I'm going to say next by a figure that we'll find in this painting who is almost equally forgotten as Augustus and his Sibyl, but makes, I think, my first main point for me, which is that likenesses of emperors, even if they're not representations of emperors themselves, are used to add meaning to paintings, and that if we don't spot them, we tend to miss out. So I'm starting with a few images of imperial faces which are not really emperors. Now, this is an extremely famous painting, or at least it was in the mid-19th century. It was first exhibited in 1847 at the Paris Salon, the great annual art show in Paris. And it's by Thomas Couture, and it is entitled Romans of the Decadence. It was also called The Orgy for short, and you can see why. What's represented here is what is clearly the end of what had been an all-night party. Right? And I think we can already see that the sun is coming up and these guys are pretty exhausted. They've been partying all night. It created a huge impact when it was first shown. This is just before the revolution of 1848 in France, and people thought that this was not just the Romans of the decadence, but it was also the French of the decadence. But it had a really long history in the kind of moralizing tradition of the West. A couple of decades later, an American art magazine actually called it the greatest sermon in paint ever rendered, and suggested that it should be on show in every American high school because it was a good lesson for people. I mean, thank God American high school students were spared it. But you can see the point. We are here looking at Rome in its moral decline. But it also raised, though the overall point is obvious, it also raised some pretty tricky questions. And I've just given you a couple of details here, but on the right, you see a couple of disapproving figures, people, two blokes observing the orgy semi-clad going on, often assumed to be noble provincial foreigners looking at the decadence of Rome. But I'm most curious in a way about the statue which oversees the scene, and that you can see it here on the left-hand side. It's a statue which was believed to be the charismatic early imperial prince Germanicus. And he, I think, makes you think twice about what's going on in this painting. I mean, partly, I think you see, gosh, there's Germanicus, and he's naked, right? There's quite a lot of other nakedness or semi nakedness in this painting. Germanicus is there as a reminder that nakedness can be heroic, unlike what these partygoers, wherever they are getting up to. But anybody who knows their Roman history, whether or not this was really a statue of Germanicus, we don't know, it's in the Louvre. Because you think, okay, who is Germanicus? Well, Germanicus, of course, was the father of the Emperor Caligula. And I think what Couture is doing here is not just saying, look, this is an orgy going on. Come on, guys, this is Romans in decline. He's also saying we don't quite know when that decline started, because here we've got this heroic nude character, but he was the dad of, in a sense, one of the first extremely bad emperors. There is, however, something I think even more curious and even more significant. And I've marked out here with the big blue arrow just one of the party goers. Here we are in the middle of the sort of, this is the sort of survivors' party at a May ball, I guess. And here is a guy, as you can see, he is so out of it that he is falling asleep, even though he has this glorious odalisque naked right in front of his nose. But even so, there's more to him than meets the eye. There he is on the left in close-up. What you'll see if you look across to the right is you'll see that he is based very, very closely on a sculptural image identified always, now we don't, always up to the late 19th century, now we don't believe it to be the case, identified always from its discovery in the early 16th century up to the 19th century, identified as the short-lived Emperor Vitellius, who reigned for a few months in the civil wars of 69 CE, who was a notorious glutton, casual sadist, overeater, and lecher. Right? So what we see amongst the partygoers is a sculpture, the image of a sculpture in that face that people in the exhibition in 1847 recognized very easily. They said, there's Vitellius there. There's the Emperor Vitellius. Now, what's that doing for us? And I think it's adding something quite interesting. Once you have spotted it, it is adding something quite interesting to this painting, because we know, if we know our Roman history, what happened to Vitellius. He was a short-lived emperor. He was dreadful. He was the kind of guy who would go to lectures all-night orgies. But he ended up slaughtered and chucked ignominiously into the Tiber. Vitellius got his comeuppance. And I think that what's happening here in some ways is that figure of Vitellius inserted into the kind of seething mass of sort of naked and semi-naked bodies is actually saying there isn't going to be a good end for these guys. It's actually reasserting very much the moral message. Spot the Vitellius and you know that these guys who are partying now are not going to get off scot-free. Now, I think although this sculpture, this Vitellius, found in Rome, but given by its founder to the city of Venice in the early 16th century. It's not very well known in our repertoire of modern images of emperors. He was absolutely everywhere. This figure who looked the part for people when they found him in the Renaissance, looked the part of Vitellius the glutton and sort of matched up with some of Vitellius's coins. He becomes an absolute cliche of painting and sculpture. And he occurs, you find him in all kinds of places, moving outside the 19th century, but here is Veronese's famous painting of the feast in the house of Levi, which had been originally designed as a Last Supper and then renamed by Veronese. And again, I've marked out with my big blue arrow, here we are back in the late 16th century. And here in what we can think of as a biblical feasting scene, there is a figure of the carver, the steward, what Veronese calls the carver, standing at the very front of the scene, and he too is based on Vitellius. So here we have an ordinary servant at a Christian banquet, but he's the spitting image of Vitellius. What does that do to this painting? Well, I think it's a very nice joke on Veronese's part that the man who was renowned as the biggest glutton Roman emperor ever is here kind of metamorphosed into the serving man, but also the serving man with the face of Vitellius is looking directly across at Jesus. This is a kind of conversion scene, and it's converting the image, although not named, but the image lying behind that of this extraordinary evil pagan emperor. As I say, if the scene of Augustus and the Sibyl gets you everywhere in modern art galleries, the image of the Vitellius, the Grimani Vitellius, so known after its discoverer, is even more ubiquitous. And I'm just going to show you a couple of ways that he not only gets everywhere, but in sometimes you can see really adds meaning. Here is a 17th century painting of a young boy learning to draw. And the title is Boy Drawing Before the Bust of a Roman Emperor. If you look at the Roman emperor, the emperor is none other than Vitellius. And I think that it adds a very kind of dark undertone to this painting. I'm sure intentionally that this innocent lad who's doing his drawing practice, what's he drawing? He's drawing the face of the libidinous, lecherous, wicked emperor Vitellius. But it was very much, really did stand for this image, this Vitellius visage, which mostly I think have forgotten. It stood for, in some ways it stood for art itself. Here, if you ever take a trip to Genoa and you go to the Royal Palace in Genoa, there is a most extraordinary bit of early 19th century sculpture called the Genius of Sculpture. And on the left of this figure, of the group, you have the winged genius, sculpture personified as, genio. And who is the sculptor cuddling, embracing, parading? It's the figure of Vitellius. So my first point really is that, in the byways, and not, with Vitellius and Veronese, in the masterpieces of Western art, you find this figure of the Emperor Vitellius lurking with a point in all kinds of places. But in 1847, and I think it's interesting that it was at the very end of the royalist regime that was replaced in 1848 in the revolution, Vitellius, Vitellius in 1847 was more popular than he had ever been, I think, since antiquity or even in antiquity. And there were other paintings of him in the Great Paris Salon. And in the major French competition for to celebrate and to reward the new young talent, the Prix de Rome, the competition that sent budding artists off to Rome for a few years. They all had to kind of enter a competition to win this prize. What was the competition theme? What did these painters have to do in order to enter for the prize? 1847, they had to do a painting of the death of Vitellius, an horrible, brutal death. He was basically lynched, and then his body was thrown into the Tiber. And here you have, there were many entries. Here you have the two very unpleasant winning entries, first prize on the left and second prize on the right. Some critics, it has to be said, were a bit worried about whether this theme was quite appropriate for the kind of the young minds of French artists to do. For me, what this does, however, is mark a change from the image of an emperor seen through another character to the image of an emperor as emperor seen in art. And here I think there's a lot more, often, not always, but often a lot more going on than at first meets the eye. And I think hugely rewarding when you start really to put a classical eye onto the images. And I'm afraid I'm going to confess these are going to be rather kind of brutal images, because I am going to be concentrating on assassinations, but they're very recognizable. One of the most famous images, certainly started in 1859, maybe not entirely finished till 1867, is Jerome's painting of the death of Caesar, the assassination of Caesar, which is now in Baltimore. And this in some ways is a very kind of a very famous, almost familiar image, even if one can't quite place it, and was often used even to kind of provide the basis for stage sets for performances of Shakespeare's Caesar. You can see the body of Julius Caesar himself in the foreground on the left, and he has been killed underneath the very now shadowy statue of his erstwhile rival, Pompey the Great. For me, it's a very, very powerful image, because whereas most scenes of assassination are just like the ones we've seen of Vitellius, they concentrate on the moment of the killing of the emperor, and the emperor is still the kind of hero, even though he's dying. He's the victim, but he's center stage. Here, I think what's extremely poignant about this is that the body of Caesar is now just a kind of some bloody rags on the left foreground. And we have turned our attention away from Caesar to the assassins, who are fully lit in the center of center stage, holding up their daggers for a few moments, though we know it's not going to end like this. For a few moments, they're the successful ones. And I think what Jerome is asking us to reflect on here, in that contrast between now the neglected body of Caesar and the assassins, is just how fleeting autocratic power is. 10 minutes ago, Caesar was the most powerful man in the Roman world. Now nobody is looking at him, and our attention has moved on. You know, the movement of succession, of power, death, and the replacement of the emperor. It's a cruel process, and we no longer look at the guy who was the last man to rule. In fact, the bloke in the seats on the right, in what is meant to be the Senate House, he's either biding his time or he's actually fallen asleep, and he's not even interested in the assassins. But there are any number of paintings in 19th century art of capturing the moment of this transmission of power. And one of my favourites is by Lawrence Alma-Tadema, the 19th century Anglo-Dutch artist. Now, we often associate Alma-Tadema with slightly saccharine views of the ancient world, like this bathing scene. And yeah, sure, he does that. But I think Alma-Tadema has a much acuter view of wondering what the power of the Roman emperor is like than these scenes suggest. And I think there is nothing saccharine about this scene here, which is called A Roman Emperor Claudius. And what it dramatizes, what it depicts, is the assassination of the Emperor Caligula and the discovery, as we know from ancient sources and from Robert Graves' I, Claudius, of the successor to Caligula, who's been old Uncle Claudius, who no one had thought about, who's been found behind a curtain. Alma-Tadema was very interested in these scenes, and this is the second version of it that he did. And it's powerful in all kinds of ways. I mean, I think that it's very well observed. Claudius is behind the curtain, and he's wearing the red shoes that Suetonius notes was how they spotted him, how they found him behind the curtain. And yet it's a surprisingly kind of uncomfortable image if you're thinking about power. Caligula and his wife have been killed. They're no more. They're a bundle of rags like Julius Caesar, but who's calling the shots here? You know, it's not old Claudius, it's the Praetorian Guard who are going to use Claudius for their own purposes. They're the victors in this. Claudius is almost a pawn. But you ask, and I think this is what Alma-Tadema is asking, you say, what is this saying about the empire? What's it saying about how the empire changes? And one thing people have seen in this is a kind of sense that what we are here is we're in a moment of transition. You know, we are moving from the noble Augustan regime started by Augustus. In a couple of reigns, it's come down to this tawdry stuff. And we're reminded of that because here in the background, you see Claudius still on the right. In the background is a very recognizable, it's a very recognizable image of Augustus with the bloody handprints on the bottom of the statue. And I think this has often been read as Alma-Tadema, as it were, pinpointing the moment when the empire sort of went bad. I think you can also see that he's suggesting a rather kind of more a nastier version of this, in which actually the empire has always been bad. You know, Augustus was already the product of violence. And if you look in the background of this painting, what you see, and it's cut off, is what there was on the wall there was a painting of the Battle of Actium, and it says Actium underneath it. It's the painting of the naval battle that brought Augustus to power. And it was a battle in civil war. And I kind of read this as saying, look, what Al-Muqaddimah is telling us is that the empire never had good rulers. The empire was born in civil war. Actium, a civil war naval battle, gave us Augustus, and he there, with the bloody hands on his statue, in a sense sets the scene for every kind of power change ever after. But I want to finish now with just one final image, and it's perhaps even more of a favorite, and it's from a Russian artist, Vasily Smirnov, and it's a vast painting. Many of these are really big paintings, and it's The Death of Nero. And it's in all kinds of ways an extremely, I think, poignant version, again, a bit like Jerome Caesar, of the abandonment of the emperor, who in this case has been helped to kill himself. And what you see here is you see the emperor dead, he's in a pool of blood, and the only people left to him are his old nurse and serving women. And what they have done is they have come to pick up the body and take it to the family tomb. The only people who remain loyal to Nero are these women. The rest, everybody else, has gone. But what interests me, and what I think makes me think kind of in a more complicated way about the picture, is the sculpture you see at the back left. Now, what this is, there it is in the painting, and there it is, as it were, in real life, is a sculpture that we now know as The Boy and the Goose, right? A Hellenistic genre piece, I suppose we say, which has always been very puzzling. You know, is it pure kitsch? It's a boy, toddler, it's a kind of pudgy toddler, hugging or strangling a goose. Is it a kind of, is it a version of a sort of newfound Hellenistic domestic taste, or what? But more to the point, and this is what people often raise about this Boy and the Goose statue, is this little toddler having some innocent fun playing with the goose, or is he trying to kill it, right? Is he strangling it? And I think in this painting by Smirnov, what the presence of that statue does is shift those interpretive dilemmas about that group. You know, what is the boy doing? What is he doing to the goose? Shifts it on to the emperor himself, and is making us ask, was Nero having innocent fun, or was the reign of Nero a series of acts of juvenile sadism? My final thought is this, to kind of sum that up and to think about what Smirnov is asking us here, is the artist saying, as we look at the dead body of Nero, are all tyrants toddlers, really? Or, and I suppose this is what some parents would say, are all toddlers tyrants? But I think you can see there that there is a kind of sense in which the painting is going beyond just a kind of bland scene drawn from a history book. It's saying, what is an emperor? What is a tyrant? And how do you fit this sculpture into that? So at that point, I will say thank you very much and hand back over to Jimmy.
That was fantastic, Mary. And of course, you know, I couldn't escape the fact that we've had a recent experience of toddlers who may be tyrants and the other way around.
I wasn't going to mention that myself, but I'm very pleased.
Everywhere you look in the classical world, there'll be a resonance with the modern world. Now, we've never had such a global audience to one of these things. Literally, we have people from Julie from Paphos, Hilary from Texas, Marlena from India, Philippa from Auckland in New Zealand. We even got Lois is all the way from Solihull. So we've got lots of questions. Some are generally about you. So sort of the Mary Beard fan club question is, what made you first fall in love with classics, Mary? If you can keep it down to a bare hour, then we'd be very grateful.
Okay, let me try to give the quick version. One is, I'm afraid I was good at it at school. And I think, you know, when you're a teenager and you're good at something, it's sort of circular. You know, you get to like it because you're good at it, and you get to be better at it because you like it. And but I eventually found out that it was a subject that let me really do so many of the things that I wanted to do, all under the rubric of one subject. You know, I could do a bit of archaeology. I could do some of the painting that we've seen this evening. I could read Tacitus. And it was, I mean, for me, it's the world's first interdisciplinary subject. And you can move around it. You can be a specialist in one bit, or you can put a culture together. And I think the fun of classics for me, really in part through the language, but moving outside the language, was putting, you know, the fun of putting a lost culture together. I'm thinking about us as much as them, you know.
Yes, I know. And for me, it was, I could get, you know, in my little room in Liverpool, in my bedroom, I could get a lot of murder, death, deceit. And as you say, for a 14-year-old boy, a bit of soft porn as well, which is always very helpful at that age.
I remember looking at all those bits that we suddenly realized had been cut out of some of our texts, and then going and finding out what the line was that they'd removed, and you know, all in the pursuit of scholarship. It was great.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions for you. It says here, from Colin Drummond, was there a racial aspect to how different Roman emperors were viewed in the 19th century, e.g. Septimus Severus, Elagabalus, Syria, Philip the Arab, not to mention the Spanish and Balkan emperors? And in the 21st century, do these emperors deserve study from a racial diversity point of view?
Well, I mean, one answer to that is yes. I mean, I think that one of the most distinctive features of Roman emperors is that just as the Roman Empire incorporates all kinds of different cultures and ethnicities, so did the office of emperor. Now, I don't think that means that, you know, the Roman Empire was entirely unprejudiced. The Roman people in the Roman Empire had all kinds of prejudices about foreigners. They didn't have racist prejudices against foreigners, which I think is a crucial point. Now, they had so little racist prejudice that to this day, we don't fully know. We have no idea what Septimius Severus looked like. He comes from Libya. He is the first emperor from the continent of Africa. And his wife, Julia Domna, is from Syria. And that opens up a kind of version of an imperial hierarchy, which is not like what you see in conventional Roman movies. Absolutely not. But it also appears not to be, and you've got to be careful about this, but it appears not to be discussed by Romans in racial or racist terms. And I think the Roman Empire, brutal and horrible and exploitative as it was, and it was sure that, is something that is useful for us to look at, because it doesn't run on racial or racist lines. And is that we can see a very different way of understanding how the Mediterranean and North African world works if we look at Rome. So I think it's worth every bit of study. I mean, I balk only slightly because I think that Romans had prejudices, they just weren't the same as ours. But happily, I think it's good to look at cultures whose prejudices are different. It helps us see what our own were.
Yeah, it is difficult though, isn't it, when you've got the kind of black and white discourse on social media to articulate this sense of ambivalence about that.
I think social media has not, I try, but social media has not proved a very productive organ for discussing some of the complexities
No.
of Roman culture, power, and cultural diversity and ethnic diversity, you know?
No, Twitter don't do nuance, I think.
I have learnt to my cost, you know, all my, I say in self-defense, this is appallingly kind of self-exculpatory, but I say in self-defense that most of the scrapes I've got into have been because I've been trying to do nuance in 140 characters, whatever it is, 250,
well,
you know.
I hope you've learned.
Bad idea.
Yeah, it is a bad idea. So I've got quite a long question here, but quite a detailed one from Christopher Burden Strevens from the University of Kent, who says, how do we reconcile the couture painting and its polemic against Roman decadence with the spirit of 1848? If individuals of all kinds, not just intellectuals, but also more proletarian sorts, were inspired by liberal ideals that put antiquity on a pedestal, libertas and all that, how does that sit alongside the darker side of the couture painting?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, and there is an enormous amount of discussion of this painting after the Salon of 1847, and modern art historians have desperately tried, for obvious reasons, and I've tried to fit it into very directly into the politics of 1847-48, and to make the critics directly respond to this as if that was what it was about. Now, that is a very hard nut to crack, actually, and you do see quite a lot of discussion about the French aristocracy being as decadent as the people in the painting. You also see some very nice or kind of pointed satires about the sheer extravagance of the painting itself. There's one wonderful commentary in a satiric magazine which says, you know, that canvas is so big, it's meters and meters across. You could have dressed a whole poor family in the amount of canvas it took for you to paint that on. So there is a kind of social political element underneath, but it very rarely comes down to a direct, simple commentary on what's going on in France in the 1840s. Though there has to be some reason why every bloody place you go in 1847 is full of images of Vitellius. Right? You know, something is going on there about popular protest, about assassination, about imperial vice. Something is going on there, but it's much more complicated and much more, you know, go back to Twitter, much more nuanced than thinking, oh, the Romans are simply an analogue for the July monarchy.
Right. So I'm just flipping through here, Mary. Give me a second. Hi, Mary. How did the British Empire affect the reception of Roman emperors in the 19th century?
Well, I think that I go about that question in a slightly different way. And I think that we tend to think, and it's not entirely untrue, that the British Empire in the 19th century found its legitimation in Roman imperialism. That somehow, you know, how did the British think of themselves? They thought of themselves as modern Romans, and I think that that's in part true, but far too oversimplifying. And I think that one of the things that these paintings point out to you or help you see is that there's much more ambivalence about autocratic power, and possibly by extension about imperialism, than we give the 19th century credit for. I mean, we tend to think the 19th century is, just a kind of whitewash of imperialist justifications, sometimes but not always mobilized by a Roman precedent. And part of it was, but actually what the Romans offer you, and what they offered the 19th century, was they offered a problematizing of that too. They said, you go back to Tacitus. What's empire? What the Romans do? They make a desert and call it peace. Now, so those kind of imperial critiques were embedded there alongside that kind of sense of imperial justification. And it's, again, it's just much more nuanced, much more subtle, much more morally uncertain, actually, than we give them credit for. It's easy to kind of write off the 19th century as if they were, unthinking imperialists who hadn't hadn't sort of twigged it. But actually, there's quite a lot of debate going on here, and the Romans are helping that. There's a horrible, horrible truth, I think, which is that some of the best critiques of imperialism come from cultures, imperialist cultures. They know what they're at.
Well, certainly some of the poetry and literature of the 19th century was critical of
Exactly.
our imperial.
Yeah.
And of course, again, that's another debate which defies social media.
Yeah.
Was the British Empire a good or bad thing? Discuss. We don't have time. Finally, a fun question, really, and it says here from Hugh Bonneville, your co-star in W1A. Whether I believe that or not, but which Roman?
I did have a cameo in W1A once.
He says you did. You co-starred with him. Which Roman emperor would you like to interview and why?
Oh God, that's I'd like to get a lineup of them all, and go, do the sort of, the Brian Blessed in I Claudius going along the line, saying, right, did you sleep with my daughter? Right. I think that the sane answer says, well, it has to be Augustus.
Mm-hmm.
The great, at the very start of the Roman Empire is this bloody enigma, and whose kind of version of what he was doing we don't understand, and which we retroject a grand plan to, but we can't see it was there. So if a serious historian says I'll have Augustus, but I think that I'd really go, people talked about Syrian emperors, if I really wanted if I was speaking the truth, I'd say I'd go to the 3rd century emperor Elagabalus, the great nephew of Septimius Severus's Syrian wife, Julia Domna, and I would find out what the empire looked like from the point of view of an emperor who was a Syrian and also had a reputation that makes Caligula look like a sweetie.
Well, maybe with modern technology, the BBC could set that up for you.
Maybe. Yeah.
With a hologram or something.
A hologram.
Well, listen, I'm sure everybody out there across the world would like to thank Mary for that. The time has flown by, as usual, but thank you so much, Mary. It was a fantastic talk, and you're a fantastic communicator of what is great about the classics. So thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Hilary Hodgson, who's going to actually interview, instead of me doing some laborious pitch on behalf of Classics for All, we thought it was much more fun to hear from Hilary interviewing Lydia Kuvichak, who's actually one of our teachers who's out there doing the great work of Classics for All. So Hilary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. And Mary, you are an intensely hard act to follow. So, and for those of you who are, we've got an international audience, so I'm going to give a very wee introduction, talk for 10 minutes, a few questions that will come through Jimmy, but feel free to leave if we're the pudding rather than the sweet. For those of you who don't know about Classics for All, we've been going for 10 years. And in this time, we've trained 3,000 teachers from state secondary schools and primary schools in the UK, that is non-fee paying schools, to teach classics, in part because there's a shortage of classics teachers in this country. Many of the schools we work in are in areas of socio-economic disadvantage, which belies the fact that many people see classics as an elitist pursuit. We do this because we really profoundly believe that pupils of all abilities and from all backgrounds should get access to what Mary described as this fantastically interdisciplinary culture that classics is, whether it's the Odyssey, whether it's Persia or Latin or Greek language. And we're supported in our work by individual donors and trusts and foundations. The schools we work with don't pay a penny. And we also have massive help from 17 regional networks that are often based at top universities in the UK, who support us with training and advice. And everything we do is for free. I'm delighted, quick introduction, to be joined by Lydia Kuhivchak, who's an English and classics teacher who works with our Leicester network and teaches at a school, a non-fee paying school, state school called Beecham College, which is part of the Lionheart Trust. And since 2014, 65 schools in Leicester have introduced classics, many on the curriculum, not just as an extracurricular activity. And at Beecham, Lydia is a star, and she's worked as an ambassador. She's got classics off the ground in her own school and 4 other secondary schools, as well as 4 local primary schools. During this brief chat, if you want to put a couple of questions in the Q&A, you're welcome. And by all means, email us if you want to leave and follow up afterwards. So Lydia, just to start off, I mean, you're a fascinating creature, but where did your passion for classics come from? Because you've got a very interesting backstory.
Yeah, I really liked it when Mary said that she liked classics because she was good at it. I think that's definitely part of my own story in kind of getting to where I was. But I think for me, Classics for All has been so important because I was one of those students who went to a state school and got a little bit of classics after school, thought, oh, this is great. Maybe I ought to do this more. But I went to the open days and I sat there and I looked around the room, and coming from Leicester and from state school, I just thought, I don't know if this is for me, actually. I don't know if these are the people I want to study with. So I went off and did English, which seemed a lot more kind of democratic and maybe would have different kinds of people in it and teaching it. And about halfway through my first year, I thought, you know what? I do actually want to give classics a go. And I asked my tutor if I could do some ancient Greek. And she said, that's a terrible idea. You'll fail. You've never done Greek before. And of course, as an 18-year-old, you think, right, I'm going to prove this teacher wrong. So I took ancient Greek from scratch, which, you know, I'd never done anything like that before. You know, I had to toddle off to the library with my Greek lexicon and try and figure out the grammar. And came out at the end of 2 years scraping a 2-1, which I could wave in my tutor's face and say, I did Greek, I passed. And from there I thought, actually, I ought to carry on with this. So what do I do? And I applied for scholarships, again, because, you know, you think, well, who's going to let me do what I want? And I went off to Yale University, who are incredibly generous with their money. I got a fellowship and I went to study with the wonderful Emily Greenwood at Yale. And she was the person who made me feel like I could be a classicist, actually, because until then I think I'd felt, oh, I'm just pretending, you know. I can read.
So you felt a little bit like a fake sometimes, but you got there at the end. But in terms of your teaching, and you're a born and a dyed-in-the-wool teacher, why do you think, given your experience, that all pupils, regardless of background, ability, should have access to classics, especially in the UK, where the tradition is quite an independent school one? Yeah?
And we do have a problem in this country. We've got a big divide between state and private schools. And I think it's an issue of fairness. You know, if somebody else gets to study it, why can't I? And I remember feeling that really passionately as a student myself, as a teenager. You know, why did they get to have that? Why can't I have that?
Mm-hmm.
And why do I have to do it after school? Why can't I do it on the timetable? Why can't I have as many hours as I want? And I wanted to feel like all my students would have the opportunity to make the choice. They don't all have to pick it, but they should have the chance to do it. And you know, I think for me, that's been a huge driver in making sure we not only offer qualifications, but that we start as early as possible, because research shows that the younger a student is when they're exposed to something, the less intimidating they're going to find it. So
it could, some people might say, you know, you're foisting it upon them. I mean, what do kids in Leicester get out of it? So you know, have you proof that they actually like it, whatever their background? Or not all of them will, but you know,
they love it. They love, like all children, they love the stories. You know, let's do of it. Let's do these wild and bizarre myths. But in terms of language, I think we're at an advantage where we are, because so many of my students are bi or trilingual. You know, they speak Yoruba, they speak Gujarati, they read Arabic, they speak Hindi. And so actually the language isn't intimidating for them because they've already got a couple.
Yeah.
So it doesn't come with the baggage that I think we as older adults feel is attached to this stuff. For them, it's a skill, and they like skills. And once a student masters a skill, they're proud of themselves. So it's self-perpetuating, and they're able to tell the kids in the year below, I've got this and you can do it.
I mean, was it a battle to get, you started your work as this ambassador at Beecham College, where you currently teach. I mean, how did you persuade parents and the schools to get on board?
Partly the proof is just in the thing itself. You know, after school was popular, you know, kids wanted to come, they wanted to bring their friends. And we introduced the entry-level Latin certificate. And once you tell people a qualification's involved, suddenly senior leaders go, oh, that's great. You know, we can put that on the curriculum because it's real, it's something that we can touch. And trips, you know, everybody loves a trip. Let's all get on the coach, let's go to the British Museum, let's all get a picture in front of these bits of old stone and post it and show your parents. So there was no one solution, but you know, it's drip feeding over time. You know, first year we had a club after school, second year we had 2 clubs, third year we had time on the curriculum, and other schools suddenly started getting a bit jealous and going, oh, why can't we have that?
So there was a bit of a viral effect. Sorry, that's probably not, I shouldn't say that at the moment, should I? So it spread. So it spread from Beecham. So the next step was you got, I think, more secondary schools on board. Is that correct?
I got in my car and I drove to other schools to teach Latin. And that meant that once the kids had the opportunity, other teachers could take on the Latin. So I was, you know, I said, I can train you myself, or you can sit in the classroom and watch me. And after a year, you'll be able to teach this. It's been lovely to watch staff who teach science or English or history who've never done anything like that before suddenly realize, oh, actually I can learn a new skill even at my age and my stage in my career. So that's been really nice to watch, actually.
But it hasn't stopped with the secondary schools. I mean, you're on a kind of ineluctable trail towards classics heaven. So how has it developed since you got those secondary schools on board?
Well, the secondary schools have been ticking along nicely. So the next phase was primary. So I offered them 45 minutes a week of my time and said, again, you know, if you want to kind of watch me and learn, you can. So we've now got 4 primary schools who start in year 3. So the kids are only 7. And at age 7, they're so enthusiastic. You know, they're so excited. One boy actually thought I was an ancient Roman. You know, after a couple of weeks, he said to me, pointed at the PowerPoint, he said, Miss, that's where you come from. And I said, no, but it's really nice that you think that. You know, they're so gripped by the idea of the ancient world, and they love what they just think of them as stories that, you know, happen to be with some slightly different words.
And best anecdote from a child in a classroom, Lydia? Anything you can think of?
Apart from my child who thought I was an ancient Roman, I want to do a special shout out because unbeknownst to me, one of my former students is on this call. So our A-level class, which used to be just 3 kids after school for fun, we doubled the numbers. We got students to do the full A-level on timetable. And last year, 3 out of our 9 students got a place at Oxford or Cambridge to read a classics related subject, which is amazing. I was the only person in my year to go to Cambridge at all from school. I didn't know anybody else. So for that to happen for me personally is a huge achievement. So Martha's listening, she's going to go off to do English with classics next year. So
a huge shout out to Martha and to the engine for social mobility that classics can be. Lydia, that is fantastic. Now, I'm not going to, I know that people are kind of tuning in from a wide variety of countries and places, and we don't want to extend this too long, but we've probably got time because we've been magnificently quick for a few questions. If anyone wants to stay and ask either Lydia or myself any more questions about CFA or Lydia's work. Jimmy.
Actually, well, I was going to ask a question. Where do you see this ending? What's your ambition for this? I mean, how far? Because clearly you're a force of nature. And if only we had one of you in every part of the country, we'd be fine.
I'm building an empire, Jimmy. You know, I learned from the Romans.
Clearly.
Got to be thorough. So the next step for us is, I think, you know, we've got a group of 10 schools and that's one trust. So the next step is to start supporting other schools in the area.
Right.
Because, you know, we've got so many schools that could happily offer Latin if they had the expertise. Yeah. So it's to keep training teachers and keep also using the expertise from Leicester University, whom I should have mentioned earlier. They've been brilliant in offering support for us.
Yeah, I should actually chip in there and say that Leicester University have been the engine and the powerhouse behind people like Lydia, Sarah Scott and Jane Ainsworth, who, because of their very broad and diverse kind of widening participation agenda, have been absolutely stalwart in supporting this enormous achievement in that area.
I have a story. I sat in on a class in Liverpool, my hometown, in Anfield, with Alice, who kind of runs the hub up there, and we were sat there in the very first lesson the kids were having, which is an etymology lesson where the teacher was putting up Latin words up on the board, and the kids had to chip in with English words that kind of reminded them. And one word was Maximus, and this little kid next to me, this little, just like I used to be, this ginger-haired scouser put his hand up. I said, Maximus. Yes, Tommy. What's an English word that reminds you of Maximus? He said, Pepsi Max, miss. And she was right. She absolutely endorsed it, saying, you're absolutely right. Big Pepsi. And honestly, the children were fantastic. It was one of the best hours I'd spent that year. It was so alive. You know, it wasn't, people talk about the classics as being dead subjects. It was the most alive hour I'd spent that year with anybody. It was so I can see how energizing it is, even though it must be also very time consuming and exhausting for you. But honestly, that was a fantastic talk. So thank you both very much. But I think we now have run over time, which is always a good time. So are we going to say goodbye, Hilary?
Yes, we're going to say goodbye. But if anyone wants to ask any more questions, you can file them to Classics for All at our email address, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Yes, and also if you're going to give us any money, which I'm sure you're desperate to give us, please go onto the website and find out how to do that. And I won't limit the amount that you give us. Just go mad. Okay, everybody. Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, Hilary. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.